Jake Martinez stared at the email on his laptop screen for the third time that morning. His rent was going up again, and this time there was no way he could afford it alone. A converted warehouse apartment in downtown Seattle had been perfect. For his freelance graphic design work, with its high ceilings and big windows that let in plenty of natural light. Now he would have to find a roommate or move back in with his parents in Ohio. He had tried the usual roommate websites, but most people wanted someone who worked regular hours and didn't blast music while working on projects at 2 in the morning. Jake's creative process was chaotic, and he knew it. When inspiration struck, he could work for 18 hours straight, surviving on coffee and whatever takeout he could find. When he hit a creative block, he might spend days just lying on his couch, staring at the ceiling and letting his mind wander through elaborate daydreams. That was when he saw the ad for the Interspecies Cultural Exchange Initiative. At first, he thought it was some kind of joke. The program offered housing subsidies to humans willing to live with alien exchange students who were studying Earth culture. Jake had heard about the aliens living among humans, but he had never met one personally. They mostly kept to themselves in special districts in major cities, working as diplomats or researchers. The application process was surprisingly simple. Jake filled out forms about his living habits, work schedule, and personality traits. He mentioned that he was an artist, worked from home, and preferred quiet roommates. 3 days later, he received a message that he had been matched with someone named HFY from the Veltar species. The message included a photo of a humanoid figure with pale blue skin and large dark eyes that seemed to take up half of his face. Jake's first meeting with HFY happened at a coffee shop downtown. The alien was shorter than Jake expected, maybe 5.5 feet tall, with a thin build and long fingers that seemed to have an extra joint. His skin looked like it had been dusted with silver powder, and when he smiled, his teeth were perfectly white and slightly pointed. He wore simple human clothes, jeans and a gray sweater, but they looked somehow formal on him. "You are Jake Martinez," HFY said when Jake approached his table. His voice was soft and had a musical quality to it, like he was always about to start singing. "I am grateful that you are willing to share your living space with me." "Yeah, no problem," Jake said, sitting down across from him. "I mean, I need the help with rent, and you need a place to stay. Seems like it works out for both of us." HFY nodded slowly. "I am here to study human culture and social interactions. My species finds your emotional expressions very interesting. We do not experience emotions the same way humans do." "How? Do you guys experience emotions then?" Jake asked, genuinely curious. "We sense them as patterns of energy," HFY explained, "like colors or music, but felt instead of seen or heard. Human emotions are particularly strong and complex. They create what we call resonance patterns that we can detect from several meters away." Jake felt a little uncomfortable with that information. "So you can, read my mind?" "Not thoughts," HFY said quickly. "Only emotional states. When you are happy, sad, angry, or afraid, we can sense it. But we cannot know what you are thinking about or what memories you are experiencing." That seemed reasonable enough to Jake. He had lived with roommates before who could tell his moods just by looking at him anyway. At least HFY was being honest about it up front. They agreed on the living arrangement that same day. HFY would pay half the rent plus utilities, keep his belongings in the smaller bedroom, and respect Jake's need for quiet when he was working. In return, Jake would help HFY understand human customs and social situations that might confuse him. Moving in together was easier than Jake had expected. HFY owned very few possessions, just some clothes, a few books written in symbols that looked like mathematical equations, and a small device that he said helped him communicate with his home planet. He was neat and quiet, spending most of his time reading or watching human television shows with an intensity that made Jake think he was taking notes. The first week went smoothly. Jake worked on a logo design for a local restaurant while HFY observed human interactions by watching cooking shows and romantic comedies. They cooked simple meals together, with HFY asking detailed questions about why humans added salt to food, or why they preferred certain textures over others. Jake found himself relaxing around his alien roommate faster than he had with most human roommates. HFY never complained about noise, never left dishes in the sink, and never brought strangers home at odd hours. He seemed genuinely interested in everything Jake did, from his design work to his habit of talking to himself while he worked on it. It was during the second week that Jake started to notice the strange coincidences. He had been working on a particularly difficult project, designing promotional materials for a tech startup that couldn't decide what image they wanted to project. Frustrated and blocked, Jake had spent the afternoon lying on his couch, letting his mind drift into an elaborate fantasy about being a space explorer who discovered a planet full of crystal cities and flying vehicles. The next morning, HFY approached him with a book about human architecture and urban planning. "Jake, I have been researching your species' methods of city construction. I find it fascinating how you balance functionality with aesthetic appeal. Do you think humans will ever build cities that can move or change shape?" Jake stared at him, remembering his daydream about the crystal cities that could reconfigure themselves based on the needs of their inhabitants. "That's a really specific question. Why are you thinking about that?" "I have been watching documentaries about human engineering," HFY said. "Your species has such creative solutions to problems. I wonder if you have considered the possibilities of adaptive architecture." Jake shrugged it off as coincidence, but over the next few days, he started paying more attention to the timing of HFY's interests. When Jake spent an evening fantasizing about being a master chef who could create dishes that changed flavor as you ate them, HFY showed up the next day with questions about molecular gastronomy and food science. When Jake daydreamed about being a detective solving crimes in a futuristic city, HFY became fascinated with human law enforcement and started watching police procedural shows with an academic intensity that made Jake slightly uncomfortable. The pattern was too consistent to ignore, but Jake couldn't figure out how it was happening. HFY had said he could only sense emotions, not thoughts. But somehow, the aliens' research interests were matching Jake's private fantasies with an accuracy that seemed impossible to explain as coincidence. Jake began to wonder if his alien roommate was being completely honest about his abilities, or if there was something about human-alien interaction that neither of them fully understood yet. Jake decided to test his theory about the coincidences. If HFY really could somehow sense his fantasies, then Jake would create a fantasy so specific that there would be no way to explain it as coincidence if his roommate reacted to it. On a Tuesday morning, while HFY was out at the library researching human social customs, Jake settled into his favorite spot on the couch and closed his eyes. He deliberately crafted a detailed fantasy about being a marine archaeologist who discovered an ancient underwater city off the coast of Japan. In his daydream, he swam through coral-covered temples and found strange artifacts that proved an advanced civilization had existed thousands of years before recorded history. Jake made sure to include very specific details in his fantasy. The underwater city had spiral towers that twisted up from the ocean floor, covered in symbols that looked like a combination of Egyptian hieroglyphs and mathematical equations. The artifacts he discovered were made of a blue-green metal that seemed to glow with its own inner light. He even imagined finding a chamber filled with crystalline structures that hummed with energy when touched. When HFY returned that evening, Jake acted completely normal. They cooked dinner together and watched a documentary about penguins. Jake went to bed without mentioning anything about underwater cities or marine archaeology. The next morning, Jake woke up to find HFY sitting at their small kitchen table, with his laptop open and several library books spread around him. The books were all about underwater archaeology, ancient civilizations, and deep-sea exploration. "Good morning, Jake," HFY said without looking up from his screen. "I have been researching human exploration of your planet's oceans. Did you know that less than 5% of Earth's oceans have been explored by humans?" Jake poured himself coffee with hands that shook slightly. "That's interesting. What made you want to learn about that?" "I have been thinking about the possibilities of undiscovered civilizations," HFY said, finally looking up at Jake with his large dark eyes. Your species has such a short recorded history compared to other intelligent species in the galaxy. I wonder if there might be evidence of earlier human civilizations that have been lost to time. Like what kind of evidence? Jake asked, trying to keep his voice casual. Perhaps structures built in locations that are now underwater due to changes in your planet's geography, Zexai said. Or artifacts made from materials that your current technology cannot identify or reproduce. Jake nearly dropped his coffee mug. The blue-green metal from this fantasy had been specifically described as unknown to modern science. Have you found anything about that kind of stuff in your research? There are some interesting theories, Zexai said, turning his laptop screen toward Jake. Look at this article about anomalous sonar readings near the Japanese coast. Some researchers believe they might indicate artificial structures on the ocean floor. Jake stared at the screen. The article showed sonar images of what looked like geometric shapes rising from the deep ocean floor. The shapes were spiral and tower-like, exactly matching what he had imagined in his fantasy. This is probably just underwater rock formations, Jake said weakly. Perhaps, Zexai agreed. But the mathematical precision of the shapes suggests otherwise. I find it fascinating that your species continues to discover new things about your own planet. Jake excused himself and went to his room, claiming he needed to work on a project. Instead, he sat on his bed and tried to process what had just happened. The coincidence was too exact to be explained away. Somehow, Zexai had responded to his specific fantasy about underwater archaeology with research that matched his imagined discoveries almost perfectly. Over the next few days, Jake conducted more tests. He fantasized about being a pilot who flew experimental aircraft that could change shape during flight. The next morning, Zexai showed him articles about adaptive wing technology and asked detailed questions about human aviation development. Jake daydreamed about being a musician who could create songs that made people experience specific emotions just by listening to them. Within hours, Zexai was researching the psychological effects of music on human brain chemistry and asking Jake if he had ever considered learning to play an instrument. The most disturbing test came when Jake spent an entire evening fantasizing about being a chef who ran a secret restaurant that only served dishes made from ingredients that didn't exist on Earth. He imagined exotic spices that grew on distant planets and fruits that changed color and flavor based on the eater's mood. The next day, Zexai presented Jake with a detailed analysis of human taste perception and a collection of recipes from various alien species that had been adapted for human consumption. I have been wondering, Zexai said, if you would be interested in trying some traditional Veltar cuisine. Many of the ingredients cannot be found on Earth, but I have found substitutes that create similar flavor profiles. You just happen to research alien food recipes? Jake asked. I have been curious about the differences between human and Veltar sensory experiences, Zexai explained. Food is one of the most intimate aspects of culture. Understanding how different species experience taste and smell can reveal important information about their psychological and social development. Jake realized that his roommate always had reasonable explanations for his research interests. If Jake hadn't been conducting deliberate tests, he probably would have accepted these explanations without question. But the timing was too consistent, and the specificity too exact for coincidence. The situation became more complex when Jake started noticing that Zexai's reactions to his fantasies were becoming more intense. When Jake daydreamed about adventure scenarios, Zexai became visibly excited, his pale blue skin taking on a slight silver shimmer. When Jake fantasized about romantic situations, Zexai became quiet and contemplative. Spending hours writing in a notebook filled with those mathematical symbols, Jake began to feel like his privacy was being invaded, even though he couldn't prove that Zexai was doing anything wrong. The alien had been honest about being able to sense emotions, and he had never claimed to be able to read thoughts. But something was definitely happening that went beyond normal emotional sensing. The breaking point came when Jake decided to test whether Zexai could sense the content of his dreams while he was sleeping. Jake went to bed early and deliberately guided his thoughts toward a very specific fantasy as he drifted off to sleep. He imagined being an explorer who discovered a hidden valley where time moved differently, allowing him to live for centuries. While only days passed in the outside world. When Jake woke up the next morning, he found Zexai in the kitchen reading a physics textbook about temporal mechanics and relativity theory. On the table next to him was a handwritten list of questions about human perception of time and aging. Jake knew that he could no longer ignore what was happening. His alien roommate was somehow accessing his fantasies, and Jake needed to find out how and why. Jake waited until Zexai finished his breakfast and sat down with his usual morning research session. The alien had spread out papers about time dilation effects and was making notes in his strange mathematical language. Jake could not take it anymore. "We need to talk," Jake said, closing his laptop and turning to face his roommate. "I know what you're doing." Zexai looked up from his papers with those large, dark eyes. "I am researching human scientific theories about temporal mechanics. Is there something wrong with this?" "Stop pretending," Jake said, his voice getting louder. "You're not just sensing my emotions, you're reading my thoughts, my dreams, my fantasies. Every single thing I imagine, you somehow know about it." Zexai's skin shifted from pale blue to a more silver color, which Jake had learned meant he was nervous or uncomfortable. "I do not understand what you are suggesting, really?" Jake stood up and began pacing around their small living room. "Yesterday I dreamed about time travel and hidden valleys where time moves differently. This morning you're researching temporal mechanics. Last week I fantasized about underwater cities and you showed up with books about marine archaeology. The week before that I daydreamed about shape-shifting aircraft and you started asking about adaptive wing technology." "These are coincidences," Zexai said, but his voice sounded less certain than usual. "Are they?" Jake stopped pacing and stared at his roommate. "Let me test that theory right now. I'm going to think about something very specific, and we'll see if you suddenly develop an interest in it." Jake closed his eyes and deliberately imagined being a person who could communicate with plants and convince them to grow in impossible ways. He pictured himself making flowers bloom in winter and trees grow in perfect geometric patterns. He opened his eyes and looked at Zexai. Zexai's skin had turned almost completely silver, and he was staring at Jake with an expression that looked like fear mixed with fascination. "Your emotional resonance just changed in a very unusual way," Zexai said quietly. "It became very complex and layered, like you were experiencing multiple emotions simultaneously." "That's not an answer," Jake said. "Can you sense what I was thinking about, or not?" Zexai was quiet for a long moment, and Jake could see him struggling with some internal decision. Finally he spoke. "I can sense more than just emotions. I did not lie to you about that, but I did not tell you the complete truth either." "What's the complete truth?" "When humans experience strong emotions, they create what we call resonance patterns. But your species does something that no other species we have encountered does. You create detailed emotional scenarios that are not based on current reality. You imagine situations that have never happened and may never happen, but you experience them as if they were real." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. "You mean fantasies and daydreams?" "Yes, most species can only generate emotional responses to actual events or memories of actual events. But humans can create complex emotional experiences from pure imagination. To my people, this is like watching a movie that plays directly in the emotional spectrum." "So you've been watching my fantasies like they were entertainment?" Zexai's skin darkened back to its normal blue color. "At first, yes, I had never experienced anything like it. Your emotional imagination is incredibly detailed and vivid. But then I realized that your fantasies are not random. They follow patterns and contain information that suggests possibilities I had never considered." Jake sat down heavily on the couch. "You've been studying me like I'm some kind of lab experiment." "Not studying you," Zexai said quickly, "learning from you. Your imagination shows me ways of thinking that my species cannot achieve on our own. We are logical and practical, but we cannot envision things that do not already exist. You can. Imagine entire worlds and scenarios that have never been real and you do it constantly. That doesn't give you the right to spy on my private thoughts. I am not spying, Zexhai said, his voice taking on a defensive tone. I cannot control what I sense any more than you can control what you see with your eyes. When you have a vivid fantasy, the emotional resonance is so strong that it would be like asking me to ignore a bright light shining directly at me. Jake felt his anger growing. Then you should have told me the truth from the beginning. I trusted you. I thought you were just a quiet roommate who was interested in human culture. Instead, you've been feeding off my imagination like some kind of psychic parasite. The words hurt as soon as Jake said them, and he could see that they hurt Zexhai. Too, the alien's skin turned pale and he looked down at his hands. I did not intend to deceive you, Zexhai said softly. In my culture, sharing emotional experiences is considered a gift. I thought you would be pleased to know that your imagination brings joy and wonder to another being. I did not realize that humans consider their fantasies to be private. Of course they're private, Jake said. They're the most private thing about us. There are secret thoughts, our desires, our fears, our dreams. You can't just help yourself to them without permission. I understand now, Zexhai said. I have violated your trust and your privacy. I am sorry. But Jake was not ready to accept an apology. Sorry doesn't fix this. How do I know you're not still doing it right now? How do I know you'll stop? I cannot stop sensing your emotions, Zexhai said. But I can stop researching the topics that appear in your fantasies. I can stop acting on the information I receive from your emotional resonance. That's not enough, Jake said. I need to know why you're really here. Are you studying humans for some kind of research project? Are you reporting back to your people about what you learned from spying on my thoughts? Zexhai stood up suddenly, and Jake could see that his hands were shaking. I am not a spy. I'm here because my people need to learn from humans, but not in the way you think. What do you mean? My species is dying, Zexhai said, his voice barely above a whisper. We have become too logical, too practical, too focused on what is real and immediate. We have lost the ability to imagine solutions to problems that have never been solved before. We need human imagination to help us find new ways of thinking. Jake stared at his roommate, processing this new information. Your whole species is dying because you can't imagine things? We face challenges that require creative solutions, but we can only think in terms of what has worked before. Your species can imagine possibilities that do not yet exist. That is why we need to learn from you. And you thought the best way to do that was to secretly feed off my fantasies. I did not know there was another way, Zexhai said. I was told to observe human creativity and report on what I learned. I was not told that humans would consider their imaginative processes to be private. Jake felt betrayed all over again. So you are a spy. I am a researcher, Zexhai said. But I have learned that there is more to human imagination than my people expected. Your fantasies are not just entertainment or creative expression. They are a form of problem solving that might be able to help my people survive. That doesn't make this okay, Jake said. You should have asked permission. You should have been honest about what you were doing. You are right, Zexhai said. I have made mistakes. I do not know how to repair the damage I have caused. Jake looked at his alien roommate, who seemed smaller and more vulnerable than he had ever appeared before. Part of Jake wanted to throw him out immediately, but another part was curious about what Zexhai had learned and why his people were dying. I need some time to think about this, Jake said finally. I need to figure out if I can trust you again. Zexhai nodded slowly. I understand. I will give you space to consider what I have told you. Jake went to his room and closed the door, leaving Zexhai alone with his research papers and his mathematical notes. But even with the door closed, Jake could not shake the feeling that his alien roommate was still somehow aware of every thought and emotion he was experiencing. Jake spent 3 days avoiding Zexhai as much as possible in their shared apartment. He worked late in his room, ate meals at different times, and pretended to be asleep when his roommate tried to talk to him. But curiosity was eating at him like a slow poison. He kept thinking about what HFY had said about his species dying and needing human imagination to survive on the fourth day. Jake's curiosity won over his anger. He found HFY sitting at the kitchen table staring at a notebook filled with those mathematical symbols. The alien looked tired, and his usually bright blue skin seemed dull and faded. "What are you writing?" Jake asked, sitting down across from him. "Zex single quotes." HA looked up, surprised. "I am trying to translate some of your fantasy scenarios into mathematical concepts that my people might understand. It is difficult because your imagination does not follow logical patterns. Can I see?" HFY hesitated, then turned the notebook toward Jake. The pages were covered with symbols that looked like equations, but they also had flowing curves and spirals that reminded Jake of art more than math. "This is my attempt to describe your fantasy about the underwater city," HFY said, pointing to a complex diagram. "I am trying to show how your mind connected the concept of lost civilizations with advanced technology and environmental adaptation. The mathematical relationships are very complex." Jake studied the symbols, not understanding them but fascinated by their beauty. "This looks more like a poem than a math problem." "In my culture, mathematics and poetry are the same thing," HFY said. "We express complex ideas through patterns and relationships rather than words. But human imagination creates patterns that we have never seen before." "Tell me about your people," Jake said. "Why are you dying?" HFY closed the notebook and looked directly at Jake. "My species evolved to be perfect problem solvers. We can analyze any situation, understand all the variables, and choose the most logical solution. This ability helped us survive and build a great civilization. But now we face a problem that has no logical solution." "What kind of problem?" "Our home planet's sun is dying faster than our science predicted. We have maybe 50 years before it becomes uninhabitable. We need to find a new home, but every planet we have studied has problems that make it unsuitable for our species." Jake leaned forward. "Can't you just move to a different planet anyway and adapt?" "That is exactly the kind of thinking we cannot do," HFY said. "We can only see the problems and obstacles. We cannot imagine solutions that do not already exist. We cannot envision ways to adapt or change that we have never tried before. But humans can." "Yes, your species looks at impossible situations and imagines ways to make them possible. You dream of technologies that do not exist, social structures that have never been tried, and solutions that seem illogical but somehow work." Jake thought about this for a moment. "So you're studying my fantasies to learn how to think like humans?" "I was, but I have discovered something more important. Your fantasies are not just random imaginative exercises. They contain actual solutions to real problems. You just do not realize it." "What do you mean?" HFY opened his notebook again and flipped to a different page. "Remember your fantasy about the underwater city? 3 days after you had that dream, human scientists announced the discovery of underwater structures off the coast of Japan. Your fantasy described them almost exactly." Jake felt a chill. "That's just a coincidence." "Is it your fantasy about shape-shifting aircraft came 2 weeks before your military announced successful tests of adaptive wing technology. Your daydream about plants that could grow in geometric patterns happened 1 day before a botanist published research on programming plant growth through genetic modification." Jake stared at HFY. "You're saying my fantasies predict the future?" "Not predict, create. Your mind explores possibilities that do not yet exist. And somehow this exploration helps bring those possibilities into reality. It is as if your imagination is connected to the creative force of the universe itself." "That's crazy," Jake said, but even as he said it, he remembered other times when his daydreams had seemed to come true in strange ways. How is that even possible? "I do not know," HFY admitted, "but I have been documenting the correlations, and the pattern is undeniable. Your species has an ability that we thought was impossible. You can imagine new realities into existence." Jake stood up and began pacing again. "Even if that's true, why does it matter for your people?" "Because we need someone who can imagine a solution to our survival problem." We need someone who can envision ways for our species to adapt to new environments or develop technologies that we have never considered. We need human imagination to help us find possibilities that our logical minds cannot see. And you think, I can do that? I think you are already doing it. Every time you fantasize about space exploration, colonizing other planets, or adapting to alien environments, you are exploring solutions that could save my people. But you are doing it unconsciously, as entertainment rather than problem solving. Jake stopped pacing and looked at his roommate. What would happen if I tried to do it consciously? If I deliberately fantasized about solutions to your people's problems? Zexai's skin brightened slightly. I do not know, but I believe it could be the key to our survival. Your unconscious fantasies have already shown me possibilities that our greatest scientists never considered. If you focused your imagination on our specific challenges, you might be able to envision solutions that could save both our species. Both our species? Yes, the same solar instability that is killing our sun exists in many other star systems. Your own sun will face similar problems in the distant future. The solutions we develop together could eventually help humanity as well. Jake sat down again, his mind racing. This is a lot to process. You're asking me to believe that my daydreams are some kind of cosmic problem-solving tool, and that I can use them to save an entire alien species. I am asking you to consider the possibility, Zexai said. I'm asking you to help me understand how your imagination works so that we can use it to find solutions that neither of our species could discover alone? And what about the trust issues? What about you spying on my private thoughts? I propose a partnership, Zexai said. Instead of me secretly observing your fantasies, you could share them with me voluntarily. You could tell me what you imagine, and I could help you understand how those visions might translate into real solutions. We could work together instead of me working in secret. Jake considered this. Part of him was still angry about the deception, but another part was intrigued by the possibility that his imagination might actually be useful for something important. What would this partnership look like? You would continue to fantasize, but with conscious intent to explore specific problems. I would analyze the patterns and possibilities you discover, and help you understand how they might be applied to real situations. Together, we might be able to bridge the gap between human creativity and practical implementation. And if I say no, then I will respect your decision and find another way to help my people. But I believe we have already proven that we work. Well, together, even when we did not realize we were working together. Jake looked at his alien roommate, who was watching him with those large, dark eyes full of hope and desperation. Despite his anger about the deception, Jake could not ignore the possibility that his weird imagination might actually be able to help save an entire species. I need to think about this, Jake said finally. This is bigger than just roommate problems. This is about the survival of your entire species. I understand, Zexai said. Take all the time you need. But please remember that we may not have much time left to find a solution. Jake nodded and went back to his room, but this time he was not avoiding Zexai. He was trying to decide if he was ready to use his imagination to help save an alien species from extinction. Jake spent the next 2 days researching everything he could find about the Veltar species and their dying homeworld. Most of the information was basic diplomatic data, but he found some scientific papers that described their sun's unusual instability and the projected timeline for when their planet would become uninhabitable. The numbers were sobering. Zexai had not been exaggerating about the urgency of their situation. On Saturday morning, Jake found Zexai in the kitchen making tea with precise, careful movements that reminded Jake of a ritual. The alien skin was its normal blue color, but Jake could see tension in the way he held his shoulders. I've made my decision, Jake said, sitting down at the table. I want to try the partnership, but I have conditions. Zexai turned around, his large eyes bright with hope. What conditions? First, complete honesty from now on. No more secrets? No more hiding information? If you sense something from my emotions or fantasies, you tell me about it. Second, this has to be voluntary on my part. If I want to stop at any time, we stop. No pressure, no guilt trips about your people dying. Agreed, Zexhai said immediately. What else? Third, I want to understand how this works. I want you to teach me about your people's science and technology so I can make better decisions about what to imagine. And fourth, if we discover something that could actually help your people, I want to be involved in presenting it to them. This isn't just about me being your imagination source. We're partners, Zexhai nodded slowly. These are reasonable conditions. I accept them all. Good, Jake said. So how do we start? Perhaps you could begin by learning about our specific challenges, Zexhai suggested. The more you understand about our situation, the more focused your imaginative exploration can be. Over the next few hours, Zexhai explained the details of his people's crisis. Their sun was expanding and growing unstable due to unusual magnetic field fluctuations. They had approximately 50 years before the radiation levels would make their planet uninhabitable. The Veltar had identified several potential new homeworlds, but each had significant problems. One planet had the right atmosphere and temperature, but its gravity was 30% stronger than what the Veltar were adapted for. Another had perfect environmental conditions, but it orbited a binary star system that would require completely different agricultural techniques. A third option had ideal gravity and stellar conditions, but its atmosphere contained gases that were toxic to Veltar physiology. Your scientists must have thought of solutions to these problems, Jake said. They have proposed logical approaches, Zexhai replied. Gradual genetic adaptation over many generations, development of protective technologies, or terraforming techniques to modify planetary environments. But all of these solutions would take hundreds of years to implement, and we do not have that much time. What about just moving to multiple planets? Spreading your population out? That creates the problem of maintaining cultural and genetic diversity across multiple worlds. Our social structure depends on complex emotional resonance networks that would be disrupted by such separation. Jake leaned back in his chair, processing this information. Okay, so you need solutions that work faster than genetic adaptation, don't require centuries of terraforming, and keep your people together as a unified species. Exactly. These constraints make the problem appear impossible to solve using conventional approaches. But you think human imagination might find unconventional approaches? I hope so, Zexhai said. Your mind works in ways that mine cannot? You see possibilities where I see only obstacles. Jake closed his eyes and tried to let his mind wander toward the Veltar-S problem. At first, he felt self-conscious trying to fantasize on command, but gradually he relaxed into it. He imagined the Veltar homeworld, with its pale blue sun growing brighter and more dangerous each year. He pictured the alien cities that Zexhai had described, filled with beings who thought in mathematical poetry and felt emotions as energy patterns. Then Jake let his imagination explore solutions. What if the Veltar didn't have to choose just one new planet? What if they could create a mobile civilization that moved between worlds as needed? He imagined vast ships that were entire cities, capable of supporting millions of people as they traveled between star systems. The ships could land on different planets during different seasons, following optimal environmental conditions across multiple worlds. Interesting, Zexhai said, and Jake realized he had been speaking his fantasy out loud. Mobile civilization architecture. That approach would maintain social unity while providing access to multiple planetary resources. But the energy requirements for moving such massive structures would be enormous. Jake's mind immediately jumped to another possibility. What if the ships didn't have to carry all their own energy? What if they could harvest energy from the phenomena they encountered? Solar energy from different stars, gravitational energy from planetary flybys, maybe even energy from the cosmic background radiation? Zexhia's skin began to shimmer with silver highlights. Energy harvesting during transit would reduce the need for stored power, but the engineering challenges would be immense. Everything seems impossible until someone figures out how to do it, Jake said, warming to the creative process. What if the ships weren't built like traditional spacecraft? What if they grew like living organisms, adapting their structure to the energy sources they encountered? Biological engineering combined with technological systems, Zexai murmured, making notes in his mathematical language. Adaptive architecture that responds to environmental conditions. This is the kind of thinking my people struggle with. Jake felt a strange excitement building as his imagination gained momentum. He pictured ship cities that could reshape themselves, extending solar collection arrays when near a star, or growing gravitational anchors when passing large planets. The structures would be part machine, part living organism, designed to thrive in the void between worlds. The ships could even reproduce, Jake said suddenly. If they're partially biological, they could grow new ships as the population expands. The Veltar wouldn't be limited to just one fleet. They could become a truly spacefaring species, with multiple city ships exploring different parts of the galaxy. Zexai stopped writing and stared at Jake. You are describing a complete transformation of our species, from planetary dwellers to space nomads. It would change everything about how we live and organize our society. Is that necessarily bad? Not bad, Zexai said slowly. But it is such a radical departure from our current existence that my people would struggle to accept it. We prefer gradual, logical changes to dramatic transformations. But you said yourself that gradual solutions won't work because you don't have enough time. Sometimes dramatic problems require dramatic solutions. Jake could see Zexai processing this concept, his skin shifting through different shades of blue and silver. You are right. Perhaps the reason we cannot solve our crisis is that we are limiting ourselves to solutions that preserve our current way of life. We are trying to remain the same species we have always been, just in a different location. Maybe the real solution is to become a different kind of species entirely, Jake said. Maybe this crisis is an opportunity to evolve into something better rather than just something that survives. Over the following weeks, Jake and Zexai developed their partnership into a daily routine. Jake would spend time each day deliberately exploring imaginative solutions to various aspects of the Veltar crisis, while Zexai analyzed these visions and translated them into technical concepts that could be communicated to his people. The process was more collaborative than Jake had expected. Zexai's questions and scientific knowledge helped guide Jake's imagination toward more practical possibilities, while Jake's creative leap showed Zexai entirely new ways of approaching problems. They discovered that Jake's imagination was most effective when he was relaxed and not trying too hard to find solutions. The best ideas came when he let his mind wander freely through the problem space, following interesting possibilities wherever they led. 3 months into their partnership, Zexai received a message from his homeworld requesting a progress report on his research. Instead of submitting a typical scientific document, he sent a collaborative presentation that included both his mathematical analysis and Jake's imaginative scenarios. The response surprised both of them. The Veltar High Council wanted to meet with Jake directly to discuss his ideas. They were particularly interested in the concept of adaptive ship cities and the possibility of transforming their species into space nomads rather than trying to recreate their planetary civilization elsewhere. They want to offer you a position as a creative consultant to our survival planning committee, Zexai told Jake. You would be the first human to work directly with the Veltar government on such an important project. Jake looked at his alien roommate, who had become a true friend and partner over the past months. What do you think? Should I do it? I think, Zexai said, his skin shimmering with what Jake had learned was the Veltar equivalent of a smile, that you are already doing it. We just need to make it official. Jake realized that his strange ability to fantasize solutions into existence had found its purpose. He was no longer